Hey Lanier, this is Drew Lassen, presenting my second song of my final mix portfolio. This song is one of my own, my capstone album, and Drew Hardesty was drumming in it. I played bass and guitar, and Sam sang and did other vocals in it. So I'll first start off with the drum set. Um, the thing about the drums is that this song is a really pretty much quiet and dynamic song, so there wasn't really too much compression that I used really for anything. So we'll start off with the kick. Um, this is the kick in. Um, so relatively straightforward. The first thing I did I took out around 143 hertz and 290 hertz because I felt that those were really flat and sounded really kind of like cardboardy. So I took out those two frequencies, and usually I boost in the upper frequencies to give it a presence, but this wasn't a song where the kick is at the forefront of the mix, and it's more you feel the mix rather than it being really clicky and popping through the mix. And the sub kick I left alone. I didn't apply any equalization to that, and this is what it sounds like. Yeah, so straightforward, kind of hard to hear. The snare top, what I did to this was I applied a high pass filter so that it gave room for the close mic kicks, and I boosted at 4.1K to give it some presence and really to give it some shine. And Drew is just hitting the rim for this whole song, so he never actually hits the snare. And because of that, I took out the snare bottom microphone because it wasn't really contributing anything, and instead it was just contributing a lot of random, the actual snares themselves, but it wasn't really going for that. And also took out, because you heard a lot of the kick drum in that microphone as well. So took out the kick and the unnecessary snare sound. And for the overheads, I applied a high pass filter relatively high at 315 hertz, and I boosted around 2.5K for again that shine and presence in the mix. And then I compressed these. It looks like I overly compressed them, like by bumping the input and taking down the output, but just because Drew played so softly in this song, that's just what I needed to do in order for it to actually compress anything. It's actually just slightly being compressed. It mainly grabs on when he hits the cymbals or something like that, and at a ratio of 4-1. I set a pretty slow attack and a mid-range release for this one. Luckily, like with this plugin, it doesn't distort when you bump the input and take down the output. So I was able to, slightly compress this low signal without, distorting it or adding anything to that signal. And for both these overheads, like always, it's overhead left is pan left, overhead right is panned right. And I also applied this Aphex Vintage Oral Exciter. I applied a decent amount, and what this does is really kind of brightens it up. And here's the overheads by themselves. And I also bust it to this reverb auxiliary track, and I use this PSP Easy Verb plugin with a room setting, and immediately when I put it on, this is exactly what comes up. I thought it was perfect, and that it didn't need any adjusting. So I left the time where it was. I took down the dampening a little bit, and left the mix at 50%. So this is what it sounds like with that reverb auxiliary track in it as well. So it sounds like, obviously, like there's a lot of reverb, but in the mix and with all the other mics and the guitars and the bass and the vocals, it didn't seem like that there was too much, and it felt like a good amount. And so, just to illustrate what exactly these aural exciters do, here's the overheads with it and without it. So really adds a lot of high end and kind of makes the overhead sound crisp, which I like. And then for the room, as you can see, I put a large high pass filter on here at 315 hertz and bumped 2.5K just like I did in the overhead to give it some presence. And this is what that sounds like. And I'll also bust it to that same reverb auxiliary track. And you're not really able to hear that in the mix, but it more contributes to the feel of the overall song, since I just slightly blended those over the drums, or under the drums. And this is what the kit sounds like as a whole. Yep. And then here's the bass. As you can see, I had to do some slight volume automations, and for some reason I automated this instead of just taking it out. Can't remember why I did that. Anyways, there's a large bass build up here that I took down. I applied this low shelf to give room for the kick and the sub kick, but this specific note right here was just really sticking out, and I didn't want to attenuate this even more, so I just manually went in and wrote the automation for that so that this low shelf wasn't affecting all the other notes. So basically I applied, as I said, low shelf to give room for the kick and the sub kick. I found that around 650 hertz was just a really annoying mid-range frequency, and usually I use a sharper Q when cutting, but pretty much everything around here didn't sound so great, so I made it a more narrow Q. And also I usually bump a little bit more in the high end to give it presence, but this bass was more feeling it and supporting the low end rather than cutting through the mix. I also used the Sans amp plugin, and I was messing around with some of the presets, and I really like this in your face bass kind of preset. I adjusted a lot of other things as well on it, so this isn't exactly how it pops up, but basically this gave it a lot of low end and really rounded out the bass, so I thought it sounded pretty good. Anyways, here's the bass soloed. And without anything. Yep. And I took my bass and I ran it into the Millennia DI to capture that DI, so it's no amp, just DI, and that's the main reason I use the Sans amp plugin. And now for the Marshall, or the guitars, I should say, I tested out a bunch of amps. Just my amp and Bobby's Marshall JCM 2000. A bunch of settings on my Vox 8050 volt and mic placement, but really wasn't too happy with how that sounded, and so I stuck with Bobby's amp, and I put a 57 on it and in addition to a 421, and I thought those sounded pretty good together. For the Marshall 57, I applied a low shelf and took out around 1.2K. And for this one, I did the exact same thing, and then I blended them with the levels. And for the 57, I really wanted a kind of spacey, echoey sound in this, and I tried it with a bunch of different reverb and delay plugins, but I ended up going to the CLA guitar plugin, and I took all the EQ settings because I liked how it sounded without them, and I didn't want to add any extra bass or any extra treble. Um, I slightly compressed it, as you can see, and I bumped the reverb, delay, and pitch settings. So here's what that sounds like. And without this plugin, so obviously when you cut it out, it sounds a lot more dry and sterile, but when all three of these are used in tandem, it really creates what I feel is a nice, spacey, kind of like echoey reverb sound. I thought that sounded great. Then onto the vocals. As you can see, here are my other guitar tracks that I was like messing around with. After I comped Sam's vocals, I ran them through a de-esser, and I took away 5.5K, because I usually take out somewhere around here, and that's just where I felt like was kind of an annoying frequency when it really like pops up. So got the de-esser to grab that away when that happens. And for EQ, I applied a high pass filter, took away around 500 hertz, which kind of that mid-range sound. I bumped 2K to really give it some presence, and I added a little bit of a high shelf in order to really brighten the vocals up. And here's what those sound like by themselves. I'm hanging on to something, but it's sinking. And obviously, I forgot to mention, I used the 1176 Blueface edition. I'm hanging on. So it's compressing at a decent amount because I wanted kind of like a consistent dynamic range with these. Relatively quick attack and normal release setting with a 4:1 ratio. And also for this, I bussed his vocals onto its own reverb track, which is a hall setting. Usually I was using, as I said before, this room setting, but I really wanted, a lot of reverb on his vocals just to get that certain effect. And I also use this H delay, and I set it to 82% wet, and no feedback, but just a good amount of delay. And here's what that sounds like with everything. I'm hanging on to something, but it's sinking. So it kind of sounds cheesy out of context, but I thought it sounded a lot better when it was in context and really filled out everything. Then here we have his harmonies. Oops. So kind of hard to hear those just by themselves, but again, a de-esser 5.5K. And for this one, since it was the harmony, the other melody was kind of taking up, after I applied the high pass filter, the other melody was kind of taking up 2K, so I pushed this down so it wouldn't compete with that. Then I added a high shelf in order to really brighten up these harmonies. Here's what they both sound like together. Below. So, I wanted these a lot more sterile and dry sounding than the reverb, so they wouldn't both kind of have a huge tail, and so that this one would be the primary one that you're hearing. Then for his third set of vocals, he is had to do some volume automation for this one too. For the third set of vocals, he's screaming, so here's what these sound like. And I'm crawling. For this, I applied a high pass filter, and I used the CLA vocal plugin, and obviously it's panned right, but later I right here. I panned it right, just so, when the first time he's screaming, you hear it come out of your left ear, then you hear it come out of your right ear, just to give it some differentiation, and so that wasn't up center with this vocal, and this vocal. So I gave it a little bit more room. And for the CLA vocals setting, I took down the bass a little bit. Left the treble where it was. And since obviously there's a lot of dynamic range, and I didn't want this just popping up, I selected this brick wall setting and really pushed it. And then I wanted to use my own reverb and delay, so I took these all the way down, and I used a stereo spreader to make it sound more full. And that's how I give, obviously, as you heard, a good amount of reverb for this vocal. So here's what they all sound like together. Starting from right here. I'm finding out, and I'm crawling. Yep, and that's what that sounds like. And for this fourth set of vocals is kind of these oohs and ahs, as you can see here. Oops. Obviously I had to do some volume automation for that as well. And here's this. And for that, I applied a high-pass filter around 139 Hertz, took out a little bit of this mid-range, bumped 2K for presence, and applied a high shelf to give it a little bit more shine in the mix. And then I compressed these ones a good amount, and I added this multi-chorus effect, so it sounded like there was a couple of vocalists on this one, and it wasn't just dry, because these vocals are supposed to be like in the background more than anything, so I didn't want them just sounding dry in the front of the mix. So here's what that sounds like. Oops. I can just... Yeah, so kind of in the back of the mix. Also bust it to the reverb and delay auxiliary tracks. And the last thing that I did to give this some kind of variation is that I added this lo-fi effect at the very beginning, so you can hear it. So kind of hard to hear at first, but it comes in. Almost sounds like I automated an EQ to kind of sweep over the frequencies, but instead I automated the sample rate. So I put it all the way down, then to give it this really weird, messed up kind of sounding, and then eventually it sounds normal. So here's what that sounds like. And I was messing around with the overheads a little bit, so they're too high right now, but those sound a little bit more natural in my final mix. And of course, whenever I'm bouncing anything down to an MP3, because I recorded everything at 24 bits, so obviously MP3s are 16-bit, so I added this dither plugin, so that nothing funky was happening, and it sounded good at a lower bit rate. And anyways, that's it for this song.